So, please give a big welcome to Hoy and Steve Higgins.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Church on a Saturday, eh? Who knows? I'm going to start with what we like to think of as our national anthems. They're better than the one that exists for us all to sing. This is one by a fellow called Reg Buros. Steve likes to sing this one. England green and England grey.
England green and England grey, look out on a summer's day, to all things bright and fair and gay. My oh my love, my England. I believe in dignity, rich or poor, we're all born free. Austerity and slavery, well, I thought they were all behind us. I don't believe the BBC, monarchy or anarchy, or an empire built on piracy. In our history books you find us England green and England grey, look out on summer's day, to all things bright and fair and gay. To my oh my love, my England. For years our women had no pay, no rights to work or equal pay. God bless the cripple and the gay. The fragile flowers of England, shut the factories, shut the mines, punish those who fell on our times, as we honour those who do the crimes. The greediness of England, England green and England grey, look out on summer's day, to all things bright and fair and gay. To my oh my love, my England. How can a man respect a man when he steals his house and sells his land and takes the wages from his hand to pay for his own expenses? The NHS is England's jewel, is bartered by Westminster's fools to justify the public school. And the military defences, England green and England grey, look out on a summer's day, to all things bright and fair and gay. To my oh my love, my England. Sing the songs of old John Bull, Cecil Shaw and John and Paul. Come English folk, come one and all, and sing the sweet songs of England. Take my hand, walk with me down the back roads to the sea. Despite it all, you must agree, there's none so sweet as England. England green, England grey, look out on summer's day, to all things bright and fair and gay. To my own, my love, my England, England green and England grey. Look out on a summer's day, to all things bright and fair and gay. To my own, my love, my England, England green and England grey. Look out on a summer's day, to all things bright and fair and gay. To my old, my love, my England.
Green and England red. This is my personal national anthem. It's a song that I wrote called The Face of England. And like the last line of the Reg Muros song there, we have got a wonderful country. We've got a most beautiful country on God's earth. Thank you. But we can't be turning out the lights on people, can we? Can't we now? This is the face of it. From the white towering cliffs over the rolling downs, through the meadows green, to the swift running waters of the wild countryside. This is the face of England. From the gardens of hope, from the yards of desire, through the streets of gold, past the mills and the factories where the wives and children wept. This is the face of England. From the crumbling city walls, where the ragged people hide, watching the world go by, to the cardboard comfort of the night on the town. This is the face of England. Once we had shipyards, now we men who sit on walls and don't do anything. Once we had miners, once we had miners, now we've the enemy within. Police with riot shields, to the rivers running down the wild city streets. This is the face of England. Turn your face away, turn your eyes away, turn your back on me, England, my own. Turn your face away, turn your eyes away, turn your back on me, England, my own. Turn your face away, turn your eyes away, turn your back on me, England, my own. Turn your face away, turn your eyes away, turn your back on me, England, my own. England, my own. Okay. Excuse me a second. This is a song, well, it was originally a Sam Cooke song. Fantastic Sam Cooke. Change is Gonna Come. You may have heard of it. You may have enjoyed it. Okay, I'll do my best. Sam Cooke, but Sam Cooke, change is gonna come. He's talking of the change that he wants to see in his lifetime that affects him. So I've changed a couple of verses that's more suitable to us. I was born. I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like that river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know change won't come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, and I'm afraid to die. 'Cause I don't know what's out there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know change won't come. Oh, yes, it will. The rich man in his castle, the poor outside the gate. You get your reward in heaven, you just have to wait. It's been a long time coming, but I know change won't come. Yes, it will. Change won't come. I go to my brother, help me see through these lies. He says, brother, be strong, stand together like diggers and organize. It's been a long time coming, and I know. Yes,
So, would you please give a massive Wigan welcome to the MP for Leeds East in 2015, Mr. Richard Burgon.
Thanks so much, and it's wonderful to be in this parish church where I understand that Gerrard Winstanley himself was baptised in 1610, was it? Can't be far out. But it's great to be here with you. It's wonderful to hear the music to get us thinking about the struggles of the past and allow us to think about the struggles of the future. And I want to just start off by congratulating everyone who's involved in putting on this series of events, and of course the Diggers Festival every year. Last year I went to the Levellers Festival in Burgon, which is fantastic too. And I think it's really important that we examine, analyse, celebrate and learn from the socialist history in our country. Because some people, of course, would have us think that somehow socialism is alien to this country and its ideas imported from elsewhere. There's actually, as Tony Benn, more than any other MP really explained, there's actually a rich scene of socialist history in our own country's history. It's important that we don't let that be forgotten. And so I want to start off, and I think it's really appropriate, with some words from Gerrard Winstanley, which I think helped to put everything into context. And these words are from his declaration from the poor, oppressed people of England. And this is what Gerrard Winstanley wrote. We are resolved to be cheated no longer, nor be held under the slavish fear of you no longer, seeing the earth was made for us as well as for you. And if the common land belongs to us who are the poor oppressed, surely the woods that grow upon the commons belong to us likewise. Therefore, we are resolved to try the uttermost in the light of reason, to know whether we shall be free men or slaves. If we lie still and let you steal away our birthrights, we perish. And if we petition, we perish also, though we have paid taxes, given free quarter, and ventured our lives to preserve the nation's freedom as much as you. And therefore, by the law of contract with you, freedom in the land is our portion as well as yours, equal with you. And if we strive for freedom, and your murdering governing laws destroy us, we can but perish. Powerful words, declaration from the poor, oppressed people of England. And that message of rising up against oppression, that message of equality still resounds today. And so what I want to talk about today is, of course, a bit about the history of the True Levellers and Gerrard Winstanley, but also about the relevance of their story to the challenges that we face today. Now, I don't pretend to be an academic expert on the history of the English Civil War or the English Revolution, as some people call it. So as well, for me, it's been useful researching my trip to Wigan today. And it was in the introduction that Tony Benn wrote to the verso edition of Gerrard Winstanley's A Common Treasury that Tony Benn kind of put the English Civil War, the English Revolution into context. And Tony Benn said, not everyone realises that we had a revolution in England long before the French Revolution, the American Revolution, or the Russian Revolution. The legacy it has left for us is of supreme relevance today. The overthrow and execution of the king after a civil war that was led by Parliament against the monarchy began a long period of change and ended with the return of the monarchy and the beginning of what we call parliamentary democracy. But during those troubled years, things were said that are as true today as they were at the time, and arguments were put forward that would still arouse the same controversy. And many of you, and I'll be quoting Tony Benn a lot, one because he was one of my political heroes growing up, but also because I'm proud to be the secretary of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs, which Tony Benn founded in 1982. And one of Tony Benn's key books, really, is Arguments for Socialism. And he talks in that book about the different traditions within the British Labour and Trade Union movement. And of course he talks about the levellers, he talks about the influence of Christian socialism, and he also talks about the influence of Marxist thought as well. But in his book, Arguments for Socialism, Tony Benn said that the issues raised in the historic conflict between Charles I, resting his claim to govern Britain on the divine right of kings, and Parliament represented, albeit imperfectly, a demand for the wider sharing of power. They remain alive in British politics to this day because they concern the use and abuse of state power, which is a subject of universal and continuing relevance. The levellers grew out of the conditions of their own time. They represented the aspirations of working people who suffered under the persecution of kings, landowners, and the priestly class, and they spoke for those who experienced the hardships of poverty and deprivation. The levellers developed and campaigned, first with Cromwell and then against him, for a political and constitutional settlement of the Civil War which would embody principles of political freedom that anticipated by a century and a half the main ideas of the American and French revolutions. Their advocacy of democracy and equality has been taken up by generations of liberal and socialist thinkers and activists, pressing for reforms, many of which are still strongly contested in this country today. And Tony Benn wrote that in 1982. So who were the diggers? Now, the diggers didn't really call themselves the diggers, so I understand. That name was given to them by others. They called themselves the true levellers. So one of the relevances we have in the story of the levellers is that there was a split on the left. I know that's never happened since, where some people who are more left-wing leave the organisation to found their own. So the true levellers, or the diggers as they were dubbed, emerged from the levellers, and they were even more progressive than the levellers. They were even more ahead of the time than the levellers. Indeed, Fenner Brockway called them Britain's first socialists, and I highly recommend Fenner Brockway's book of the same name, which talks about the history of the English Civil War. And again, Fenner Brockway said it was not until the later 1640s that the resistance gained significant proportions by the setting up of digger colonies on common lands in a number of counties. I believe it was 10 counties that we have evidence that the diggers operated in. The diggers sought economic emancipation. They called themselves the true levellers, demanding human equality in daily life. They finalised the 17th century revolt. I think that's a very important sentence from Fenner Brockway there. They finalised the 17th century revolt. In other words, the true levellers, or the diggers, inspired by Gerrard Winstanley, were the most advanced movement in all the movements in the English Civil War and around that period. And Tony Benn said that the true levellers were remarkable. He said even more remarkable were the diggers, or true levellers, who established the clear outlines of democratic socialism, including a demand for the common ownership of land, of equal rights for women, for an accountable parliament, and for the provision of public services in health and education. All this was evolved 2 centuries before Marx illuminated the nature of capitalism and analysed the conflicts that it would release. And let's consider this. We're talking about the 1640s, and we all know, at least from school, a bit about the society that existed as of then. So at a time when people were still arguing that the monarch had been appointed by God to rule over us all, the true levellers were arguing for equal rights for women, for the common ownership of land, for public services in health and education. How incredible. And that's why it's right that we celebrate them today. And that's why it's right that we study them as part of our radical inheritance as a labour and trade union movement in this country. So who was Gerrard Winstanley, who was baptised in this church? Fenner Brockway said that the Diggers were extraordinarily fortunate in having as a champion one of the most outstanding philosophers and political theorists of the 17th century, Gerrard Winstanley. Now, Gerrard Winstanley, as you'll know, was a tailor born in Wigan. A tailor born in Wigan who had ideas that, if implemented now around the world, would literally turn the world upside down. And of course, as well as a theorist and a writer and someone that inspired a movement, he was also somebody who took direct action. I'll come on to that later. And Fenner Brockway said as well that looking back 3 centuries, one can surely say that he, Gerrard Winstanley, is the most relevant to the problems of thought and politics of our time. And I want to quote as well from a statement written by Gerrard Winstanley, published on the 26th of April 1649, in which he declared, "In the beginning of time, the great Creator, Reason, made the earth to be a common treasury, but not one word was spoken in the beginning that one branch of mankind should rule over another." Now, of course, Gerrard Winstanley was a deeply religious person, but his study of religion, his faith, gave him a faith in equality on this earth, not waiting for justice in an afterlife, but equality on this earth. The idea that in fact it was profoundly unnatural, profoundly contrary to the teachings of Christianity, that people should exploit each other, that some people should have a fantastic life of plenty and some should live a life of want, poverty and neglect. And Ed Simon wrote a really good piece, which you can find online in Tribune, which was written to mark St. George's Day in 2019. And the reason it was published on St. George's Day, this article about the Diggers, about the True Levellers, was as part of a process of trying to reclaim our history in this country as a history not just about kings and queens that were taught about in schools, but a history of social movements, a history of progress from below, a history of society changing for the better and people's lives being improved by ordinary people getting together and organising and making demands on the establishment, dreaming of a better world and working together to try and implement it. And Ed Simon in that piece wrote, "The Diggers' great theorist and the author of the True Levellers Standard Advanced was a Wigan tailor named Gerrard Winstanley. In language that harkens towards Marx," and remember this was 1640, "Winstanley directly attacked enclosure, writing that owning property was brought into creation by your ancestors by the sword, which first did murder their fellow creatures, and plunder or steal away their land, and left this land successively to you. Though you did not kill or thieve, yet you hold that cursed thing in your hand by the power of the sword." And as Ed Simon said, that's a pithy an explanation of the capitalist state's power and violence as has ever been written. I think it's a fair deal, isn't it really? We're not going to hold people in power responsible for the plunder of their ancestors, but neither should they benefit from that in the same way. And I think that's an important sentiment to reflect upon. So Gerrard Winstanley was outraged by what he called the monopoly of land by the lords of manors. And he said that by creation rights, the land belongs to all. And you can understand why this was so radical at the time. You can understand why this threatened those in power. And people objected to what Gerrard Winstanley said. They objected that why is it wrong for one person to be richer than another? And Gerrard Winstanley's response to that argument was very interesting indeed. He said that no man can be rich, but he must be richer either by his own labours or by the labours of other men helping him. If a man have no help from his neighbour, he shall never gather an estate of hundreds and thousands a year. If other men help him to work, then are those riches his neighbours as well as his, for they may be the fruits of other men's labours as well as his own. But all rich men live at ease, feeding and clothing themselves by the labours of other men, not their own, which is their shame and not their nobility. For it is a more blessed thing to give than to receive. But rich men receive all they have from the labourer's hand, and when they give away other men's labours, not their own, therefore they are not righteous actors on earth. And of course, Gerrard Winstanley was saying this in a society in which the powerful were seen as appointed by God, and in which the rich were seen as the greatest people on earth. And there was this idea that somehow people had been ranked by the Almighty into different gradations of wealth and power, and that was somehow just. So you can see why the speeches and writings and activities of Gerrard Winstanley and the Diggers rocked the establishment to the core. And what's very interesting is to consider the difference between Gerrard Winstanley and Oliver Cromwell. And I see every day when I go into Parliament the statue of Cromwell outside Parliament. There's also a bust of Cromwell, which used to be in the stairwell of one of the flights of steps that leads up to the voting lobby. Cromwell's been removed from there and he's hidden elsewhere now, but I still do see him sometime. But Cromwell, it's a familiar story, isn't it, really? Someone who was viewed as playing a progressive role and then was seen as betraying those, many of whom who supported his cause. And I think it's interesting how Cromwell responded to Gerrard Winstanley's arguments. And I've got a quote here from that. So Gerrard Winstanley argued as follows about the structure society must have. For you must either establish Commonwealth's freedom in power, making provision for everyone's peace, which is righteousness, or else you must set up monarchy again. Monarchy is twofold, either for one king to reign, or for many to reign by kingly promotion. And if either one king rules, or many ruled by king's principles, much murmuring, grudges, trouble and quarrels may and will arise among the oppressed people on every gained opportunity. I think we know what Gerrard Winstanley was getting at there, don't we? I think we know who he was getting at there. You know, many felt greatly betrayed that Cromwell really had replaced one king, Charles I, with another, Oliver Cromwell. So what was Cromwell's response? He allegedly commented on this sentiment by saying, what is the purport of the levelling principle but to make the tenant as liberal a fortune as the landlord? I was by birth a gentleman. You must cut these people in pieces or they will cut you in pieces. And as A.L. Morton says in his fantastic A People's History of England, for all his flirtations with the left, Cromwell was and remained a landowner with the landlord's outlook and the landlord's interests. And I think that's very interesting, isn't it, indeed? And we should reflect upon what does the phrase leveller mean, because it's quite interesting. We often hear these days, don't we, of levelling up. That's what we hear of these days. But by people such as Michael Gove and others in the government who have very little in common with the levellers, the true levellers or otherwise. But obviously, the levellers and the true levellers wanted a level society and that they wanted equality. But also, when it came to the true levellers or the diggers, it related to a description of their physical action, because the land had been privatised. They were growing hedges, the landlords in the establishment, to separate the land, to take it away from the people and have it as private enclosures which they could use to make their wealth. So the true levellers, the diggers, as you'll know, went around getting rid of these hedgerows, dividing land away from the people who should own it. And so they were levelling the land. So they were levellers in two senses, levelling the land in the practical sense, but also arguing for a more equal society. So I want to focus today on the enduring relevance of the true levellers, the enduring relevance of Gerrard Winstanley and the true diggers. And I think there are a few areas where the story of the Levellers and the story of Gerrard Winstanley has great relevance for us today. I think there's 5 areas: equality, democracy, public ownership, the environment, and direct action. Because of course, there could be no more direct action than taking over St George's Hill and having a commune there, which they did, and of course they were removed by the army. And that has echoes the direct action people take today in defence of nature and in defence of our environment and in defence of our planet. I do want to focus mainly on the area of democracy, but when we consider the question of public ownership, the question of equality, I think we do need to consider what would the diggers see today? What would they see in the United Kingdom in the 21st century? These people who gave their lives, gave their freedom for a more equal, more level society. They would find that half of England, they wanted to level the land, but they would find that today half of England is owned by less than 1% of the population. Half of England, by just less than 1% of the population, I'm sure they would have thought that things would have changed since their times. Aristocrats own 30% of the land today. Corporations own 17% of the land today. In a country, thank you, of nearly 70 million people, there are just 25,000 landowners, typically members of the aristocracy and corporations who have control of half of the country. In contrast, those who own homes in England, in total, own only 5% of the country. We have this idea, don't we, that if you have a mortgage or if you own your own house, that you're a landowner. But all the land of all the homeowners in this country equates to 5% of the land, 5% of the country. And this idea that I've quoted, which is from a book released in 2020 called Who Owns England? It's by somebody called Guy Shubsole. His figure that they own around 50% of the land, corporations and the aristocracy between them around 50% of the land, may be an underestimation because owners of a fifth of England and Wales remain actually undeclared at the land registry. The most likely owners of this undeclared land are aristocrats, as many of their estates have remained in their families for centuries, so haven't been sold and don't appear on the registry. And that takes me back to the words I quoted from Gerrard Winstanley earlier about how the very richest get their land and get their power and get their wealth. So most people do remain unaware of how much land now is owned by so few. This dramatic concentration of land ownership, I think, is an inescapable reminder that ours is a country for the few and not the many, and that it's our job to change that. Just as the Levellers and the true Levellers realised that in the period of the English Revolution, so we must realise that. Now, why should it be the case that aristocrats whose families have owned the same areas of land for centuries and large corporations should exercise more influence over local neighbourhoods than the people who live there? And coming on to the question of wealth, what kind of society would the diggers find today? They'd find a society in which to be in the top 1% of the wealthiest people in our society who need wealth of £2 million. So the top 1% in our society have around 20% of all wealth in the UK. Wealth distribution is even more uneven than income distribution. So as I say, to break into the wealthiest 1% of individuals in the UK population, you need wealth of basically £2 million. But even within that top 1%, there are huge disparities. So the average person in the top 1% has a wealth of £5 million. And it's the small number of billionaires in that top 1% that distort the figure. And the latest figures from Credit Suisse in 2021 show that there are approximately 686,000 Britons in the richest 1%, and their total wealth is £2.8 trillion. In comparison, that's more than the wealth of approximately 48 million people in this country, 70% of the population, who have a total wealth of 2.4 billion. And so it's no surprise to you, I'm sure, that we have an incredibly unequal society. Society that's getting more unequal. And the figures I've just quoted are for individuals. The wealth of the richest 1% of households was more than 3.6 million, compared with just £15,400 or less for the least wealthy 10%. But I want to also refer to the billionaire class, because figures out yesterday, you'll have seen it, the Times Rich List, which I don't think is something to celebrate, but something to worry about when we see the use of food banks in this country, the amount of poverty in this country, that some people are so grotesquely wealthy at the same time, and tell us that there's not the money there to sort out the problems in our society. There is the money there, it's just in the wrong hands. Figures out on Friday show that the wealth of UK billionaires is now at £684 billion, up 31 billion in the last year. A billion, by the way, is 1,000 million. 1,000 million. So the wealth of UK billionaires has gone up by £31 billion in the last year. But at the same time, we're being told that nurses, postal workers, university workers, workers in the civil service, teaching support staff, teachers, transport workers, that somehow it's pie in the sky that they should get a pay rise which even matches inflation. It just shows us all, doesn't it, and reminds us what a rotten rigged system we have that we need to change. So in the last decade, the wealth of UK billionaires is up by £400 billion in just a decade. That's 400,000 million. Wages are still lower today than in 2008, and they've stagnated for a decade. These figures show what's happening. The share of the economy going to workers is going down. The share of the economy going to the super rich is going up. So whilst ordinary people face a crisis in living standards, it's a boom time for some. That's why I've been arguing for a wealth tax on the super rich. And let's remind ourselves that a one-off 10% tax on any wealth above £10 million, so that's a one-off 10% tax on every pound above 10 million in wealth, could raise £86 billion. And an inflation pay rise for all nurses, an inflation matching pay rise for all nurses, would cost around £1 billion. And the wealth tax that I've just described would raise £86 billion. That really makes a mockery of this idea that there's no money there. So that's the kind of society that would, I think, shock Gerrard, Winstanley and the true levellers, who I'm sure would have thought that in the hundreds of years that have passed since they were politically active, they'd have thought that things would have become more equal than we have, a more just society than we have now. But one of the things I want to talk about, the main thing I want to talk about, is the relevance of the diggers' arguments in relation to democracy. Because I think our democratic freedoms are under threat. And this is something that attracted Tony Benn to the history of the levellers and the diggers and Gerrard Winstanley, because Tony Benn argued that democracy is the most revolutionary thing in the world, because if you have power, you use it to meet the needs of you and your community. So let's consider democracy in this country as we celebrate the achievements and struggles of the true levellers who strive for a more democratic society, economically and politically. Tony Benn argued that the people of Britain had less democratic control over their lives than we're led to believe. I think he's right. He said that if the British people were ever to ask themselves what power they truly enjoyed under our political system, they would be amazed to discover how little it is. He argued that not only is our democracy restricted in important areas of our lives, such as in the workplace, where people spend a huge proportion of their lives, but our formal democratic rights are limited too, with too much political power often unaffected by elections. And he focused sharply on addressing this lack of democracy, believing it to be key to challenging the class power at the heart of British society that's often concealed by our formal democratic and state institutions. And he set out a number of proposals. which I'll come back to later, to modernise and democratise the British state and the Labour Party. I'll return to that later. I think it's important, and when I take constituents around Parliament, I always show them the painting which I consider to be the most important painting in Parliament, and it's a painting of something that happened at the beginning of the English Civil War, where Speaker Lenthal, so Lindsay Oil's kind of political or royal ancestor, is confronted in the House of Commons chamber by King Charles, who wanted to come and arrest some members of Parliament who had been rebellious against him, but message got to these members of Parliament and they escaped on a boat down the river. So King Charles with his soldiers burst into the House of Commons chamber and asked where those rebellious MPs had gone, because he wanted to arrest them. And Speaker Lenthal made history when he responded by basically saying, in kind of flowery language compared to language I'll now use, that he wasn't allowed to tell the king without the permission of the elected members of the House of Commons. He said, "I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak without the permission of the elected members of this House." And even though, of course, the House of Commons at that point was elected by a tiny proportion of rich men in our society, that was the seed of the idea that there was a conflict between democratic power and undemocratic power, that the House of Commons, a parliament, should take precedence over the hereditary monarch. And that's why, as you may know, to this day, no reigning monarch has gone into the House of Commons chamber whilst it's in session since that day. That's why we see the ritual of Black Rod having the door slammed in his or her face, and that the king doesn't come into the House of Commons in order to deliver the king's speech. And so the point I make when I'm showing constituents around Parliament is I think it's important that when we consider the history of democracy in our society, I think we need to see it as an unfinished journey. Our journey towards a truly democratic society isn't finished, because democracy isn't just about voting. Democracy is about all areas in our society. You know, there needs to be democracy in our workplaces, in our economy. Democracy isn't just political democracy, and that's why the public ownership that the True Levellers argued for is a key part of democracy as well. And I think when considering the issue of the struggle for a more democratic society, it's worth keeping in mind the 5 questions that Tony Benn had for those in positions of political power, social power and economic power. He said these are the 5 questions to ask people. Number 1, what power have you got? Number 2, where did you get it from? Number 3, in whose interest do you use it? Number 4, to whom are you accountable? And number 5, very importantly, how do we get rid of you? How do we get rid of you? These questions serve the purpose of providing a blueprint, I think, to locate and challenge those with unaccountable and undemocratic power in our society. And Tony Benn and I believe Britain's constitutional setup was riddled with deficiencies and imperfections. He said that the British Constitution, parliamentary system and machinery of government are far from democratic in both theory and practice, and they are full of obstacles for those who want to use them to bring about reform by democratic means. He pointed out that the 3 central elements in Britain's constitutional setup: a hereditary monarchy, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The people only have a say over one of those, and 2 of those 3 maintain a feudal character. He dismissed claims that these feudal remnants were primarily symbolic. He argued in 2003, and I quote, that the existence of a hereditary monarchy helps to prop up all the privilege and patronage that corrupts our society. That is why the Crown is seen as being of such importance to those who run the country or enjoy the privilege it affords. That was Tony Benn in 2003. Of even greater concern to Tony Benn was the ability of the Prime Minister to use the power of the Crown through the royal prerogative to bypass Parliament, should they choose to, on important decisions such as whether to go to war, on making or unmaking international treaties, amongst others. And he warned that the royal prerogative, exercised not by a monarch but by the Prime Minister in the monarch's name, is the final guarantee that democratic decisions by Parliament and the people could never be allowed to undermine the hierarchical and semi-feudal system we have. And he saw the Prime Minister's personal control as contradictory to the collectivist traditions of the Labour Party. He believed that the concentration of power with the Prime Minister meant that even when Labour is in office, the Labour Party itself is not in power and can be kept outside the decision-making process. The crux of this issue, Tony Benn argued, is the lack of accountability to the party, which means members have no guarantees that ministers will follow through on policy democratically agreed at conference. And in addition to these critiques of the weaknesses within Britain's parliamentary and constitutional system, he also argued that people have no say over other whole swathes of their lives. I think it's a very important point. He said, we have a very imperfect democracy. It has no industrial elements, no democracy in the media, and no democracy in business. And I think that's important, because I think we have maybe been brought up in our society to believe that we have the most perfect democracy possible to be devised. Now, of course, we have a far, far more democratic society than the one in which Gerrard and Winstanley and the diggers operated. That's because of the struggles of people like the Levellers, like the true Levellers, like those who came after them, such as the suffragettes and, of course, the trade union labour movement, and, of course, the Chartists as well. But our journey is not over. Democracy shouldn't be confined, in my opinion, to putting a cross on a ballot paper every few years. And even that they want to make harder, don't they? Because when we consider the question of democracy, which is at the heart of what the diggers were arguing for, we have to consider the fact that three fundamental democratic rights we have in our country that were won by struggle are under attack. The right to vote. The voter ID scheme brought in by this government is a deliberate voter suppression strategy aimed specifically at those that they believe are less likely to vote for the government. And when I was campaigning in the local elections in my constituency, there's a lot of talk about people who went to polling stations and got turned away. I can tell you, I met a lot of people who never went to the polling station, and they always vote, but they said because they didn't have the voter ID, they knew it was pointless to go. And I think it's a serious matter, a serious infringement of democracy in our society, when anyone wants to exercise their right to vote, but is prevented from doing so by this voter ID scheme, which is straight from the right-wing Republican playbook in the United States of trying to suppress the votes of people who they don't think are likely to support them. And then, of course, you look at the right to strike, which has been undermined by a whole series of anti-trade union laws, most recently by this appalling so-called minimum service levels law. And then we see as well the criminalisation of protest. It makes me think about the diggers operating all those different counties, knocking down those hedges, taking over the land owned by the rich and instead working together on that land to make food for the whole community. How would they be viewed now? I think they'd be viewed now as we viewed them, as heroes by some, but I think the establishment would view them as a real problem, and one can imagine how they would be treated. So Tony Benn placed great emphasis on how the British economy operates, with a total lack of accountability which flies in the face of true democracy. I think it's interesting to reflect that even at the peak of public ownership in the 1970s, only 20% of national economic output was under the direct control of the elected government of the day. And of course that figure is even smaller today. And this was compounded by the behaviour of certain public corporations, such as the Bank of England, operating as if they were private companies. Anyway, Benn believed that the result of this was that regardless of who the British people chose to govern them, powerful and unaccountable economic interests dominate the vast majority of the economy still, with all the influence of the lives of people and communities that brings. And it was in 1991, and I think this was something that Gerrard Winstanley very much approved of, that Tony Benn proposed the Commonwealth of Britain Bill. And this as the Levellers did and the True Levellers did all those hundreds of years ago, sought to democratise Britain. It's really worth reading. This Commonwealth would have its own codified constitution with a charter of rights, enshrined social, economic and political rights, including but not limited to free healthcare, to decent housing, free transport, free childcare, a healthy and sustainable environment, culture and leisure time. The proposal shifted power into the hands of the electorate, firstly through abolishing the feudal remnants. The Lords, in the bill that Tony Benn prepared, would be replaced by a House of the People, which would be gender balanced and elected via a proportional system. The British head of state would become a president who would be voted on by the House of Commons and the new House of the People. He also sought to expand the electorate by lowering the voting age to 16, and the bill proposed a truly federal Britain with national parliaments for England, Scotland and Wales, whilst Ireland would be given the freedom to pursue a separate future, something worth reflecting upon when we consider the role of Cromwell in Ireland at the time of the English Revolution. Now, Benn's proposals were not the same as the devolution seen more recently, as these national parliaments would have decision-making power over all matters apart from the Commonwealth, economy, defence and foreign affairs, and there would be similar expansions of power in other areas of society as well. But these were the kind of arguments that Tony Benn became known for, and actually it was through Tony Benn that I first heard of the Levellers, reading what he wrote about the Levellers and reading what he wrote about Gerrard, Winstanley. And it was learning about them, which I think played a big role in pushing Tony Benn towards the idea that democracy is the most important thing we can fight for, but democracy in its widest sense. And I think democracy in its widest sense is well described by the famous phrase from the time of the English Civil War, which is that the earth should be a common treasury for all. And when we look at what these privatised water companies are doing, we understand that the message that the earth should be a common treasury for all has never been more relevant. So as we reflect upon the struggle for equality, the struggle for universal suffrage, the struggle for public ownership, the struggle for a system which ensures everyone is fed and has a fair share in the wealth that they produce, let's reflect upon the relevance of those messages today. And I'm delighted to have joined you today and shared a few of my thoughts in celebration of Gerrard Winstanley, who was baptised in this church, in celebration of the diggers who broke the law to create a fairer society, and in celebration of all those who gave their life to the creation of a truly democratic and equal society. We have a proud inheritance. I'm an internationalist. One of my great heroes, José Martí, the Cuban independence fighter from the 1800s and poet, said humanity is our homeland. It's important that we're internationalists. It's also important that we recognise the domestic and international relevance of our own radical history in this country. It's a history we can be proud of. It's a history that's not celebrated enough. It's a history that the Diggers Festival and the Levellers Festival does so much to commemorate. Our history, the people's history, is the history of that Wigan tailor, Gerrard Winstanley, whose ideas set the world alight and still inspire us today. Our history is the history of the Levellers, the True Levellers, the Chartists, the Suffragettes, the early Socialists, and the trade union and labour movements. Ours is a history that we can be proud of. Let's make sure, by working together, that we honour the memory of Gerrard Winstanley and all those people whose names are recorded in history and whose names aren't recorded in history. Do them honour with our struggles today and in the future. And when we do, I believe we'll do that most important thing and create a better society. That's the greatest tribute that we can make. Thank you very much.
This song, Lawrence introduced me to this song a few years ago. I never got around to it, and I did. And then last year when the war in Ukraine started, I thought it was a poor idea. And also what was happening in our country. I thought when Boris Johnson decided it was a good idea to spend £250,000 on refurbishing his front room or something, or some room in number 10, something number 11. And I thought, when I walk around Wigan, there's people on the streets there, and also these food banks, and I thought there's something not right. Of course, Boris Johnson has his own designer as well, doesn't he? I wonder how much he gets in. Most of us have to do our own decorating. It's called more than enough. There's always the money for missiles and tanks. There's always the money for generals and banks. There's always the money for new ways to kill, but a limited budget for you when you're ill. And there's always enough for a war. So there's never enough for the poor. There's always the money for tunnels and roads, for opera and ballet, but what about homes for MPs' expenses and fat subsidies? But there's never enough for child's nurseries, and the well-off, they always take more. So there's never enough for the poor. There's always the money for tests they can pass, or fail you for not being white, middle class. There's always a goodies for those with most to read, but there's never enough for those in most need. And there's a pay rise if you're on the board. So there's never enough for the poor. Consider how little of life that we know. We bring nothing, take nothing, pass through and go. We are all poor when it comes to the night, in need of the darkness, in need of the light. If we learn to want less and love more, well, there'll be enough for the poor. If we learn to want less and love more, well, there'll be enough for the poor. Because there's more than enough for us all.
Praise God. Says it all. This one. Says it all. And then I'll move straight from this one into one that I want you all to join in. Raise the roof.
I'll just think of what
This is not directed at all MPs, I promise you. This is Sunak came down, led by donkeys, on his head was a golden crown. We're all being led by donkeys, where we go, led by donkeys, where we go, we're all being led by donkeys. Silver spoon and golden plate, led by donkeys, from the country and the state, we're all being led by donkeys, where we go, led by donkeys, Richie Sunak, social jet, led by Richie's chopping garlic, roll, led by where we go, led by where we go, roll, led by he understands the working class, led by home with the British gas, roll, led by Richie Sunak and Gerrard, led by I can't even think of a word that we shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. All together. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We shall live in peace. Oh, we shall live in peace. Oh, we shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe The world upside down, that one. Yeah. Well, he's playing, but get started.
Should have rehearsed it.
But I'm joining you. Which one?
Yeah, which one?
Eh? Did you know that there were diggers, you know the Summer of Love in San Francisco? There were diggers there. Honest, seriously, there were people going around giving food to them hippies, what was like that, giving food and sustenance and all sorts, and they call themselves the diggers after the Wigan diggers. Honestly, see, I learned something new. And while he's getting that, I'll tell you, are you proud of the Wiganers?
Yes.
We are. We've got one of the most famous Wiganers, statue to him, in Grand Arcade, George Formby, and everybody thinks of Wigan from 20 years before anybody objected to apartheid in South Africa, he was doing it. 1948, he refused to sing, but waited on the audience, and they deported him.
Yay!
Reminding us of Joe Hammer Pro-Tonian. Hey, ready? Biggest song. In 60... Oh, you ready, Steve? In 1649, St. George's Hill, a ragged band they called the Diggers came to show the people's will. They defied the landlords, defied the laws. They were the dispossessed, reclaiming what was theirs. We come in, they said, to dig and sow. We come to work the lands in common and to make the wastelands well reserved, divided. We will make whole, so it will be a common treasury for all. The sin of property we do this day. No man has any right to buy and sell the earth for private gain by theft and murder. They took the land. Now everywhere the laws spring up at their command. They make the laws to change as well. The clergy dazzlers will never know they damn us into hell. We will not worship the God they serve. They've got every who feed the rich from poor folks out. We will be together, we need no swords. We will not bow to the masters or pay rent to the lords. We are free men and women, though we are poor. You diggers all stand up for glory, stand up now. From the men of property, the orders came. They sent the hired men and troopers to wipe out the diggers' claim, turn down the cottages, destroy the corn. They were dispersed, but still the vision lingered on. You poor take courage, you rich take care. They serve us made a common treasury for everyone to share all things in common. All people one. We come